I was formerly, like yourself, sir, a very warm advocate of the abolition of slavery. This was before I saw that there was white slavery. Since I saw this, I have materially changed my views as to the means of abolishing black slavery. I now see clearly, I think, that to give the landless black the privilege of changing masters now possessed by the landless white would hardly be a benefit to him in exchange for his surety of support in sickness and old age, although he is in a favorable climate. If the southern form of slavery existed at the north, I should say the black would be a great loser by such a change. These are the words of George Henry Evans, explaining how, to him, wage slavery is worse than slavery. Though he was a labor activist, published and edited in labor-oriented newspapers, and denounced the poor conditions of 19th century workers, he nonetheless fell for the ideas pushed by slave owners. He stopped advocating for the abolition of slavery because he genuinely believed that capitalism would do more harm to black people than slavery does. If you're confused, take a deep breath. We're about to dive into the topic of wage slavery, how it's been used by both anti-capitalist advocates and slavery advocates. We'll see what the term means, what it's supposed to underline and denounce. The topic of today's video is both a sensitive and a controversial one. We'll be exploring some very discomforting ideas, some very harmful ones, and before we even get close to doing that, I feel like there are at least two things we need to address right off the bat. First, slavery is bad. I'm saying that because I'll be exploring ideas put forth by some slave owners who opposed abolitionism. Some of these ideas are paternalism and the idea that slavery is more humane than capitalism. These ideas are obviously wrong, and I obviously disagree with them, but I do think that they're worth exploring, not because they're truthful, they're not, but because they reveal certain relationships of power within capitalism. In other words, I want to look at slave owners who said that capitalism creates more misery and inequality than slavery, not to excuse slavery, far from it, but to incriminate capitalism. I'm also saying it because I'll invite you to do a thought experiment which might make you uncomfortable, but it's designed to show the through lines between slavery and wage labor. Again, by trying to compare slavery and wage labor, I'm not trying to understate the severity of slavery, but I'm trying to expose the understatement of the severity of wage labor. Second, I want to make it very clear that I'm not equating slavery to wage labor. I'm comparing them, and the whole point of comparisons is to underline similarities, which is what I'll be doing. Now, let's start the video with a quote by Frederick Douglass, who was, if you don't know him, a former slave who became an abolitionist leader. Experience demonstrates that there may be a slavery of wages only a little less galling and crushing in its effects than chattel slavery, and that the slavery of wages must go down with the other. The man who has it in his power to say to a man, "You must work the land for me for such wages as I choose to give," has a power of slavery over him as real, if not as complete, as he who compels toil under the lash. What is wage slavery? It's an interesting concept, presenting itself as a contradiction. A slave, by definition, can't have a wage. So, what is the idea that wage slavery is trying to communicate? I've seen all sorts of definitions online, and to make the object of our study very clear, I want to narrow it down as precisely as possible. We can take the Wikipedia article on wage slavery as a starting point. Wage slavery, or slave wages, refers to a person's dependence on wages or a salary for their livelihood, especially when wages are low, treatment and conditions are poor, and there are few chances of upward mobility. I believe this is a great place to start, but I want to make some clarifications. First, I want to take out slave wages and the especially when wages are low, treatment and conditions are poor, and there are few chances of upward mobility. Though it is correct to say that wage slavery enables lower wages and worse conditions, I'd argue that it's not fundamental to the concept. One can still be a wage slave and have a high wage and good conditions. One of the biggest misconceptions about what wage slavery is that it's about miserable conditions, that the working conditions of wage slaves are comparable to the working conditions of actual slaves. That's far from being the case. Proponents of the term do recognize the fact that wage slaves aren't dehumanized, whipped, captured, sold, and bought as actual slaves are. As we'll see, being a wage slave is more complicated than being overworked and underpaid. What we have left is wage slavery refers to a person's dependence on wages or a salary for their livelihood, and this could be interpreted as a wage slave being someone who's a slave to wages, who's dependent on a salary to live. But this doesn't really address what the term wage slavery expresses. We could be talking about water slavery for how we're dependent on water to survive, and yeah, I guess that would be right, but what purpose would that concept serve? We often hear that we're slaves to our phones, for example, because we've developed a dependency, but is slavery really about that? About dependency? The slave isn't dependent on the master for their livelihood, it's actually the other way around. The master relies on the slave for their livelihood. What the term slavery refers to isn't a relationship of dependency, but of domination. In the case of slavery, we have the ultimate form of domination, ownership. So what we're talking about when we use the term wage slavery is a relationship of domination, an imbalance of power, the increase in power and control for one at the expense of the freedom of the other. But this definition leaves that out. There's no loss of freedom, no imbalance of power, not even a master to speak of. What we can add to make this more clear is wage slavery refers to a person's dependence on wages or a salary for their livelihood in a world where the distribution of and conditions for these wages is determined by a specific class. Now, this definition, I believe, gives the term wage slavery a more coherent meaning and logic. Premise 1, you need a wage to survive. Premise 2, only the capitalist can give you a wage. Premise 3, the capitalist will give you a wage only if you obey their commands. Conclusion, you need to obey the commands of capitalists to survive. I think an important concept to understand before going forward is the criticism of private property. When all private property is monopolized, is owned by a few people, then you can't possibly work for yourself. You don't have access to land, you don't have access to tools, machinery, spaces. Everything is already owned by those who have enough money to own it. Because of this monopoly of private property or the means of production, or simply put, because what is needed to be economically independent is already owned by others, then the only thing you own, the only thing you can feed yourself from, is through selling yourself, selling your physical or mental abilities, selling your time, your body, selling your liberty to someone who can afford it and make a profit out of it. This inability or impossibility to work for yourself because of the private ownership of the means of production makes it so you need a wage to survive. There's no way for you to become economically independent, to become a business owner, the owner of the means of production, without at first, and perhaps for a very long time, most likely forever, sell your liberty to an employer. Most of your life, if not all your life, you will be economically dependent on someone who has more money and therefore more power than you. There's also a conception of wage slavery a bit different from this one, but very similar in its effects. In this conception, wage slavery isn't only the idea that to survive you need to obey the commands of someone who has more power than you, but also the idea that though there is a difference between the sale of oneself, slavery, and the rent of oneself, wage labor, there is a loss of freedom in both that only varies, according to some, in longevity. As 19th century Scottish philosopher, economist, proponent of capitalism, and father of John Stuart Mill, James Mill, put it, "The great capitalist, the owner of a manufactory, if he operated with slaves instead of free laborers like the West India planter, would be regarded as owner both of the capital and of the labor. He would be owner, in short, of both instruments of production, and the whole of the produce, without participation, would be his own." What is the difference in the case of the man who operates by means of laborers receiving wages? The laborer who receives wages sells his labor for a day, a week, a month, or a year, as the case may be. The manufacturer who pays these wages buys the labor for the day, the year, or whatever period it may be. He is equally, therefore, the owner of the labor with the manufacturer who operates with slaves. The only difference is in the mode of purchasing. The product of the labor of the wage slave and the slave slave all goes to the owner. However, I'd argue that the difference between both isn't only in the mode of purchasing, but who are you giving the money to? You, at the very least, give money to the wage slave when you buy their liberty. The slave doesn't receive anything. Also, the wage slave gets to choose his master. The slave doesn't. And finally, as we'll see later with Abraham Lincoln, wage slavery alienates your freedom, yes, but at least it technically gives you a way out. This criticism of capitalism through the term wage slavery has been quite mainstream all throughout the socialist tradition, and even before, as demonstrated by Simon Linguet, an 18th century journalist, quoted in Marx's theories of surplus value, when he said, speaking of wage slaves, "They live only by hiring out their arms. They must therefore find someone to hire them, or die of hunger. Is that to be free?" In the first chapter of The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin, which I'm, by the way, reading on stream, you can find the segments on my second channel, Germinal, the anarchist philosopher writes this: "We cry shame on the feudal baron who forbade the peasant to turn a clod of earth unless he surrendered to his lord a fourth of his crop. We call those the barbarous times. But if the forms have changed, the relations have remained the same, and the worker is forced, under the name of free contract, to accept feudal obligations. For, turn where he will, he can find no better conditions. Everything has become private property, and he must accept or die of hunger." The choice for the slave isn't really a choice: work or suffer the consequences. The choice for a wage slave isn't really a choice neither: work or die of hunger. But perhaps the most interesting proponents of the term wage slavery, or its concept at least, aren't the socialists who've used it to liberate the working class, but the slave owners who've used it to keep workers in chains. George Fitzhugh was a slavery advocate, perhaps the most radical slavery advocate out there, as he advocated to enslave not only black people, but white people as well. He did so with a logical consistency uncommon to slavery advocates. He wrote 2 books about slavery, but to get a summary, there's also a pamphlet he wrote in 1849 titled Slavery Justified. In the preface of Cannibals All, Fitzhugh states that his goal is to show that labor makes values, and wit exploitates and accumulates them, and hence to deduce the conclusion that the unrestricted exploitation of so-called free society is more oppressive to the laborer than domestic slavery. Fitzhugh presented his case for slavery by opposing free society, its ideas, and its results. What is falsely called free society is a very recent invention. It proposes to make the weak, ignorant, and poor free by turning them loose in a world owned exclusively by the few, whose nature and education have made strong and whom property has made stronger to get a living. Fitzhugh says that what free society does is give freedom to the weak, ignorant, and poor by leaving them to fight alone to get a living in a world owned exclusively by the few. Thus, he says, they need to submit themselves to the few who, in this free society, become masters without the obligations of masters, leaving the poor to be slaves without the rights of slaves. I won't go too much into why Fitzhugh was against liberalism, individualism, equality, democracy, and liberty, but he saw in rapidly industrializing free society the failure of freedom, the failure of democracy, the failure of individualism. He thought the values of equality and liberty to be synonymous with free competition. We proceed to show that the war of the wits, of mind with mind, which free competition or liberty and equality beget and encourage, is quite as oppressive, cruel, and exterminating as the war of the sword, of theft, robbery, and murder which it forbids. It is only substituting strength of mind for strength of body. Men are told it is their duty to compete, to endeavor to get ahead of and supplant their fellow men by the exercise of all the intellectual and moral strength with which nature and education have endowed them. Selfishness is almost the only motive of human conduct with good and bad in free society, where every man is taught that he may change and better his condition. A vulgar adage, every man for himself and devil take the hindmost, is the moral which liberty and free competition inculcate. He saw free society as a model fueled by competition and conflict. He looked at Europe, for example, and pointed out how unhappy and discontent the masses were. Crime and pauperism have increased. Riots, trade unions, strikes for higher wages, discontent breaking out into revolution are things of daily occurrence and show that the poor see and feel quite as clearly as the philosophers, that their condition is far worse under the new than under the old order of things. Now, Fitzhugh noticed the violence arising from the class conflict baked into capitalism. He even thought and said very often that the southern slave was much better off than the northern worker. Now, that's an extremely controversial take from Fitzhugh, and he justifies it in many ways. The slave is taken care of. He's fed, he's housed, he's provided medical care. His whole family is also taken care of. They're fed, they're housed, they're provided medical care. If the slave is sick, he's still fed, housed, and taken care of. If he's sick, his family will continue to be fed, housed, and taken care of. The slave doesn't have to worry about losing his job, about losing his ability to house or feed himself, to lose the ability to provide for his family. He has security, argues Fitzhugh, that free northern workers don't have. The free northern worker has to feed himself, house himself, and provide for his own medical care. He has to take care of his family, needs to feed them, needs to house them, needs to provide them with medical care. How does the worker do that? By working for a wage determined by his employer, very often barely enough to provide for himself and his family. What if the worker becomes sick or injured? The employer doesn't have to pay him if he doesn't work, so the worker will need to find a way to provide for himself and his family despite not being paid, perhaps by getting into debt. However, he can't miss out on too many shifts or he may lose his job, meaning he won't be able to provide for himself and his family. His condition, especially in the 19th century in Fitzhugh's time, makes him extremely economically insecure and at the mercy of his capitalist masters. Fitzhugh, because he cared so much for black people, argued that by abolishing slavery in a system as competitive as capitalism, black people would struggle even more than white workers as they'd have to compete with them while being of a lesser race, again, according to Fitzhugh. However, there are many problems with Fitzhugh's arguments, mainly that he's not addressing the fact that slaves weren't living in idyllic conditions, as he seems to defend. Slaves weren't particularly well treated. Fitzhugh would answer that the free northern worker was also mistreated, not only through economic insecurity, but also through corporal punishment or overwork with 16-hour days. The slave owner actually had more incentives to treat his slaves better because they weren't as easily replaceable as free workers are. If you overwork a slave, he'll be less productive. If you overwork a free worker, you can replace him. Fitzhugh would also say that because of the ownership of slaves, slave owners had more incentive to invest in their slaves, giving them healthy meals, comfortable lodging, and not using too much corporal punishment. He might even use the example that in many plantations, they would make white workers do dangerous jobs instead of risking slaves, which were more costly. Fitzhugh's arguments aren't new or innovative. He's using the concept of paternalism to justify slavery, something that's been done over and over again, and that's based in, you guessed it, racism. Paternalism is the idea that someone, or black people in the case of American chattel slavery, are better off with a master to take care of them. Why? Because they're not developed enough to be independent, that this independence would do more harm to them than good. Fitzhugh applies paternalistic justification for the enslavement of black people, but also for the enslavement of poor, unintelligent white people. He believed that a vast majority of the population should be enslaved, but don't you think he was colorblind? He thought that most white people should be enslaved, while all black people should be enslaved. The same type of paternalism was used to justify women's free domestic labor. Women taking care of the house, the children, the cooking, and the cleaning weren't paid, of course, but were provided for by their husbands. Oh, and they couldn't really divorce back then either. Of course, a wife was her husband's de facto servant. She was housed, she was fed, she was protected by her husband. Now, the reason why I brought up Fitzhugh's ideas isn't again to promote them or to bring slavery back, but to show that even a slave owner was able to see through his logic, and you can definitely criticize his logic, that capitalism brought about relations of exploitation and of domination that are far, far from desirable. But you may say that if you were to be the most charitable to Fitzhugh's arguments as possible, that even if workers' conditions in the 19th century may have been as bad as, or at the very least, comparable to slavery, as Frederick Douglass once put it, it's different today. 21st century workers are completely fine and emancipated. Alright, maybe not completely fine and emancipated, capitalism isn't perfect after all, but contemporary workers have the best living standards in the history of humanity. They have access to food from all over the world, house themselves, have children who can go to school and not have to work until they're at least teenagers. They have access to incredible technology. They can retire at decent ages. I'm looking at you, France. We're far from the worker who toiled 16 hours a day and who could be fired at any moment. And this argument, if extrapolated to be used against the term wage slavery, is probably the strongest argument against it. And here we get to the question of reform. See, if you believe that it's possible to achieve workers' emancipation through labor reforms, it's because you believe that workers' exploitation and domination come from their conditions. However, proponents of the term wage slavery argue that the slavery comes not from the conditions of the worker, but from their relationship with their master. Reforms like the 8-hour day, for example, makes working conditions more bearable, but it doesn't fundamentally change the relationship between the worker and their master. If we go back to the formula from earlier, you need to obey the commands of capitalists to survive, could you argue that labor reforms may eventually make this ethical? Could it be ethical to have a capitalist master if, through reforms, you need to obey the reasonable commands of capitalists to survive, still making them your masters, but fair ones to the eyes of the law? The question can be asked, I guess, but what if we asked it about slavery? If we were to reform slavery, make working conditions for slaves more bearable, maybe even enjoyable, could we still argue against slavery? Imagine we're in the 1850s. Abolitionists are advocating for the end of slavery. Slavery advocates are advocating for slavery, and you just can't make up your mind. Both just seem so radical. One side wants to keep a really harmful and racist practice, while the other wants to completely eradicate it. So you go the centrist route. You're the liberal of the time. We'll keep the status quo, but we can reduce its harms, and perhaps both parties might be happy. So you advocate, because you're a centrist, for humane slavery. You look at Louisiana's Black Code, which regulated slavery between 1724 and 1803, which had articles such as making your slaves work on Sundays and holidays illegal, makes it illegal for masters to marry slaves against their will, makes it illegal for masters to not clothe or feed their slaves, makes it mandatory for masters to provide for their slaves, even if elderly, disabled, or ill. And you think, hey, maybe it is possible to make slavery humane if we take out the other terrible, inhumane parts of the Louisiana Black Code and add good ones. We then force masters to not exert physical violence on their slaves. Even if slaves are your property, you can't hurt them. The same way under animal cruelty laws, you can't beat up your dog even though it's your property. We limit the working day of the slave to 8 hours a day, to 5 days a week, maybe even 4. We limit the working age of slaves to 16 years old, and we force the masters to provide education. The master is obligated to give a range of choices as to which jobs the slave can do. We force masters to pay their slaves extra money, just a little bit. Perhaps the masters can give bonuses according to which job needs to be done most, so that slaves can spend a little money for leisure, for furnishing their room, provided by the slave master, of course, and other expenses, and perhaps buy their liberty at a price determined by the state. Now, in these conditions, and perhaps with added reforms, the only thing that the slave and the free worker wouldn't share is the choice to choose which master rules them. And as stated before, this choice of masters is not the same as the choice to have a master or not. Perhaps, again, if these reforms were adopted, the differences would be the stability of being owned by a master who provides for you through state supervision, but there's no way for you to escape him, or the choice of choosing which master you'll have, but he has little to no duty to take care of you and can abandon you whenever he wants without any remorse because you'll just find another job. Even in this thought experiment, in this fictitious scenario, you'll argue that the situation of the slave is worse, despite the conditions being better, because the slave is the property of a master. An employee can always leave an employer, with some consequences, sure, but they can at least still leave. They may eventually afford leaving their city or state to find something better. They may choose to live in tiny houses to have to work less, but in any case, they'll still need to work for an employer. They will always need a master. And perhaps here lies the fundamental concepts of wage slavery. Under slavery, a slave is a slave to one master and is paid through housing, food, healthcare, etc. Under wage labor, a worker is a slave to the capitalist class, which can pick and choose which slaves gets to work for them and for how long. These workers are not paid through housing, food, though sometimes healthcare, but with money through which they afford housing, food, sometimes healthcare, and sometimes extra expenses. Now, to conclude this long tirade of me trying to convince you that there's a through line between master-slave and employer-employee dynamics, I want to look at Abraham Lincoln. When it was time to abolish slavery, or at least to debate it, many critics of capitalism also advocated to abolish wage slavery, as we've seen already. Was that debate prominent enough for Abraham Lincoln to position himself on it? Yes. Yes, it was. The following passage is from Michael J. Sandel's Democracy's Discontent. Although he shared the abolitionists' moral condemnation of slavery, Lincoln did not share their voluntarist conception of freedom. Lincoln's main argument against the expansion of slavery rested on the free labor ideal, and unlike the abolitionists, he did not equate free labor with wage labor. The superiority of free labor to slave labor did not consist in the fact that free laborers consent to exchange their work for a wage, whereas slaves do not consent. The difference was rather that the northern wage laborer could hope to escape his condition, whereas the slave could not. It was not consent that distinguished free labor from slavery, but rather the prospect of independence, the chance to rise to own productive property and to work for oneself. Lincoln would use his own experience as a worker who used to split rails and how, through hard work and saving up, you can become a farmer or a small business owner. You can become free as in economically independent, not free as in free to choose who you're dependent on, which is the voluntarist conception of freedom, which Lincoln did not share. In his book, Sandel demonstrates the two different philosophies around the idea of freedom, the voluntarist conception and the civic republican conception, and both fought to define what freedom was to the American people. In a nutshell, the voluntarist conception is the idea that freedom is granted as long as nobody else interferes, as long as there's no coercion involved. In today's terms, this would be conceptualized as negative freedom, or freedom from government oppression, freedom from censorship, and so on. However, the civic republican conception of freedom was what we now call today a positive freedom. Freedom is not only to not be impeded upon, but to be an active participant in civic duties, because if you're not involved or can't be involved in politics, then other people are making decisions for you. If other people make decisions for you, you're not entirely free, are you? From this, civic republicans would conclude that for someone to be free, they need to be politically and economically independent. You know, self-ownership and self-governance and all of that. Lincoln, as Sandel points out, would argue that free labor isn't better than slavery because the worker consents. It's better than slavery because the worker can eventually leave wage slavery to start their own business and become financially and politically independent, therefore making them better suited to be involved in the matters of the republic. By the way, there are criticisms that I would levy on the civic republican conception of freedom, but I'll leave that probably for the live stream on Twitch. Check it out, we have a lot of fun. In conclusion, I will say, compulsion is slavery, and those disinherited of their natural rights must hire out and serve and obey the oppressing class or starve. There is no other alternative. Some things are priceless, chief among which is life and liberty. A free man is not for sale or for hire. I hope that, after all of this, I have somewhat convinced you, or at the very least made you consider that, if you have to work for a wage, to work to bring profits to someone else, and the only alternative is to either have enough money and be lucky enough to start a business successful enough for it to provide for you, or win the lottery, or marry rich, or starve, then you kind of have no choice but to work for someone else. For most of your life, you sell your body, your physical and mental abilities, your time, your freedom to someone who has enough money to buy it, just so you can survive. You sell your freedom to someone who has enough money to buy it and who uses it to make profit. Now you say, I don't like the idea of having to abandon my freedom to others just to survive. But how could it be any other way? Well, there are many different answers to that question, but the one I can give you is to look into movements who want to build alternatives. The one I have a particular preference for is anarchism, which you can learn about on my streams on twitch.tv/Germinal, Germinal with 2 A's, so it's Germinal because Germinal was already taken, or its segments on my second channel, or check out an Anarchist FAQ, which answers a lot of questions not only about the advocacy for anarchism, but also the criticisms of capitalism and the state. I have a third channel dedicated to the extremely laborious project of reading this FAQ. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you Roman Brandel, Mike Wex, Russell Chinchilla, and every other patron on the screen for supporting the channel. I'm quite financially dependent on you to survive, so please become a patron. I beg you. In any case, thank you for watching. Check out the streams, check out the other channels, and hopefully see you there. Goodbye.